Got my little table here for my various magic acts that I'll be doing during the course of the show. And I just wanted to tell you, first of all, that coming to Toronto has prompted every single one of my friends who's been here to say just how amazing it is and how much you're going to love it. You have a city that's reputation precedes it, and it doesn't disappoint. I don't believe I've ever seen a more beautiful, decent place in my entire life. It is the cleanest, nicest city. I've never seen such a big city with such a small town feel. And I can't think of a better place to talk about the defense of civilization than in this magnificent city of Toronto. Because it's the most civilized place on the earth, and its reputation is exactly that. I had an interesting experience earlier today. I got interviewed by the Toronto Sun outside of a Starbucks, and the reporter looked at me kind of in amazement. We talked for about an hour, and she said, "I've never met a Republican or a conservative before." And I thought, a fellow could make some money in this town, and you just set up a little stool and you pay people $20 and pay me to poke me with a stick. Find out what we're made out of. I've been to Canada once before. When I was 17 years old in 1976, we went up and visited friends up in Connecticut. And we decided, we'll just drive up to Montreal. So we got in our car, and this was back when we crossed the border into Canada. We could go from 55 to 70 or 75, and that alone was worth it. We drove 2.5, 3 hours up to Montreal. We pulled into a parking lot underneath a hotel, trying to find a place to stay, and ran into a French-Canadian gentleman who was working the night shift at about 2 a.m. reading a giant paper porno magazine. He said, "No rooms in Montreal," so we turned around and went right back to Connecticut. This trip has been far, far better than that. And the final thing I think I'd like to say before we get started tonight is simply this. The relationship between our two peoples, between America and Canada, is a remarkable relationship. And I'm fascinated by how the relationship actually sort of mirrors the geography, because Canada, of course, serves America a tremendous service by giving us a people to look up to. And we provide a far, far greater service to you by giving you a people that you can look down upon. We can argue with the truth of that. But the fact of the matter is that the border between our two countries is not only the best border in the world, it's the best border in the history of the world. It really is. It's a remarkable, miraculous thing that two people can live with this kind of relationship for this long. And I think that's an appropriate way to start our talk about civilization tonight and about the assault on civilization, because we have to understand that civilization, at least Western civilization as we understand civilization, is not the natural state of the world. If you look at the third world today, it's tempting for people who come from Western countries to look at the third world and to look at all of the lovely people, the genuinely lovely, decent people who live in such abject poverty and such abject lawlessness and chaos. And Western people look at the situation in a place like Tijuana or in the Ukraine. My favorite author, P.G. O'Rourke, said he went to the Ukraine, he ran into soil that was so rich you could boil it and make it into soup. And yet the villages had no plumbing, they had no running water. This is as Caucasian as you get, right? It's in the Caucasus. And he said, a Western person looks at the situation in the third world and they think to themselves, if I had $200 in an hour at Home Depot, we could solve this problem forever. We could just fix it forever. And you look at this situation and you look at the endemic problems in the third world and you think, what's the matter with those people? And I realized very early that is not the question that we need to be asking, because there's nothing the matter with those people. The third world as it exists is the state of humanity throughout history. That's what humanity has always been. We do it this way because our parents did it this way. There's nothing about the third world. Those people are not freaks. We're the freaks. We're the freaks. We're the people with the idea that the world can be made a better place, that we have an obligation to improve upon things, we have an obligation to make things work better than they used to. That's a profound way of thinking about things. It's revolutionary, it's different, and it's weird. And we are in the middle of it, so we take it for granted, but we often have to go out into the third world to realize just how pervasive our civilization is, and therefore why it needs to be defended so stridently. So before we talk about this threat to civilization, it'll probably do all of you a little good to know a little bit about me, to know where I'm coming from. because no one's got untainted information, no one has anything other than an evaluation of information based on their opinions, and their opinions are based on their experiences. So that you have a clear idea of where I'm coming from, let me tell you where I'm coming from. When I was a little boy, my dad was a hotel manager all my life. I was born in New York City, but we moved to Bermuda when I was 4, and I went to British schools and sang God Save the Queen every morning, like I guess most of you did. I had my little blazer and my patch, and I went to Saltus Grammar School in Bermuda. And when I was 5 years old, my dad, who was getting a little worried about me becoming too much of an island kid, took me to Kinley Air Force Base to show me the Thunderbirds. And I sat there in the bleachers and waiting out in the sun for 2 hours for 5-year-old boys, pretty near interminable. But these 6 jets took off and went out over the ocean. They don't do this anymore because apparently they've had some crashes. But back in those days, they took those jets out behind us. And I was sitting in the bleachers looking down at this guy giving a narration, standing there in his little blue jumpsuit. The jets had flown away. I thought the show was over. And he said, ladies and gentlemen, 1989 Air Force has been established in 1957. It's doing this whole thing. Meanwhile, these 4 F-100 Super Sabres are out over the Atlantic Ocean. I can't talk about this. We get choked up because it was just so cool. And these guys pushed it just under the speed of sound, just under. And this guy can see them behind us, but we can't see them. And these jets come over the bleachers at 650 knots. And he says, ladies and gentlemen, United States Air Force, thunder! And I look up and I see aluminum in red, white, and blue. And I drop my ice cream cone. And that was the end of little Billy as he was known from that moment. So from the age of 5 until the age of 17, I determined that I was going to fly jets for the Air Force. And once I flew jets for the Air Force, I was going to fly space shuttles for NASA, then I was going to command the Mars mission, and that's what I was supposed to be doing with my life. That's why all of my work is called Eject, Eject, Eject. It's the name of my blog, and I do video pieces called Afterburner and Firewall. I'm trying to recapture a little bit of that first love of mine, which was that love for aviation. Now, I am a proud conservative Tea Party Republican from the United States of America, but I certainly didn't start out that way. I didn't start out that way. I was a lot more liberal in college, but even by today's standards, I have to qualify that, because even when I was at my most liberal in college, I was a guy who believed in America, I believed in the American military, I believed in business. I never tried to make money for films from grants. I wanted to raise money from businessmen, make movies, sell them for more than they cost, and return them a profit. That's different than a lot of liberals in America today. But just so you know, I was a theater major. After I got out, I went to the Air Force Academy for the physical for the Air Force Academy, and I failed the vision test, just barely failed it. A few years later, I would have been able to have a radio autonomy, but it was too early for me. And they told me I couldn't fly jets. And everything I'd studied for and practiced for, I started teaching astronomy in the Miami Planetarium when I was 13 years old. I dedicated 12 years of my life to this. And I go in for a physical, and they say, no, it can't happen. You're not going to get that. Okay. So I spent a summer just stunned. I had friends who were making movies, and then they went to the University of Florida. One of them was a year ahead of me. They said, you can major in this. I said, come on. You can major in this? You can major in dressing up in makeup and costumes and prancing around on stage, and this is all you do, and you get an actual degree in this? I said, yep. I said, sign me up. So I was a theater major at the University of Florida. That's my background. I was a theater major at the University of Florida. And then I remember very clearly we were doing a show in Gainesville Little Theater. We were doing a show called You Can't Take It With You, which was the first show I ever saw and the first show I was ever in. And it was about 8 o'clock on a Tuesday, early in November in 1980. We're about to go on. And after the show was over, we were going to go out to a bar and watch the election returns come in from 1980. And just before we went on, I mean seconds before we went on, a stage manager came in with tears in her eyes saying, it's over! It's over! What's over? The election's over. What do you mean the election's over? It's 8 o'clock. It's over. Carter's conceded. Reagan's won. Tears streaming down her face. Because the warheads are on their way. And I remember thinking, this crazy old man, this doddering old idiot, this actor, is going to get us all killed. Because when I was a young man, I passionately believed in things I knew nothing about. Passionately believed in things I knew nothing about. It took a long time for me to come to where I am now. I'm not proud of this. As a matter of fact, to some degree, I'm fairly ashamed of it. You should probably know my voting record. First vote I ever cast for president of the United States was in 1984. I voted for Walter Mondale because he said he'd raise taxes. Seemed like a good idea to me because I wasn't paying any taxes. 88, I couldn't do it. I just could not vote for Dukakis. Just couldn't do it. 92, I liked George Bush Sr. quite a lot, but Bill Clinton seemed like he had good ideas. A young guy. I liked the relationship with him and Al Gore, so I was leaning a little bit towards Perot, and then Perot got back in. I said, to hell with it. I voted for Bill Clinton in 92. I voted for him again in 1996. By this time, I'm already starting to think of myself as a conservative, but they seem like good guys, seem like smart guys to me. In 2000, I was well established as the staff Republican on my entertainment company, and in 2000, I voted for Al Gore. I voted for Al Gore because I watched the debates and I just didn't like George Bush. I just didn't like him. I just didn't like the way he sounded. So I voted for Al Gore. Why? Because there were no consequences to our politics, in my opinion, back then. Bill Clinton had run up surpluses, everything was rosy. What could possibly go wrong? What could possibly go wrong with this? Civilization and all of the things that I took for granted were the natural state of mankind. It was the end of history. You may remember people saying it's the end of history. Soviet Union's gone. Communism's gone. We're left. It's just a rosy, rosy road to the .com horizon from here. What could go wrong? Then we found out. And we found out what could go wrong. Now, a lot of people I know, fellow conservatives down in, especially in the entertainment business in Los Angeles, became conservatives on the morning of 9/11, but I didn't. I was a conservative already, but 9/11 by itself did not activate me. I spent the 9 months after 9/11, didn't write anything, I wasn't active in politics, but after 9/11 I started to read. And after 9/11 I started to read articles everywhere, and all of them pretty much said the same thing. They basically said, why they hate us. What did we do to cause this? Some of them said, well, we had it coming. And that was the environment that I was in when I found out that my dad died during a fishing trip up in Canada. His death certificate has a GPS coordinate on it. He died out on a lake, fishing, doing the thing he loved most in the world. He had a funeral at Washington Chapel in Valley Forge. He lived right down Valley Forge, about 400 people there. And for reasons that remain an utter mystery to this day, he decided that he was going to be interred at Arlington National Cemetery. Now, my dad would be the first person to tell you he's not a war hero, never had a gun pointed at him. But he did sign on the dotted line. And if you sign on the dotted line and you want to be buried at Arlington, you can be buried at Arlington. Or at least his ashes were interred at Arlington. So in October of 2002, wasn't quite that late, sorry, it must have been, October. It's about a little over a year after 9/11. I stood at Arlington National Cemetery in Washington on the coldest day I've ever been in my life. It was early in the morning in October. We got there a little early, and I went out and started walking through the headstones in Arlington National Cemetery. Arlington National Cemetery, I knew by then because of my love for history, was Robert E. Lee's backyard. And as punishment for Robert E. Lee launching his talents against the Union, the Union decided we're going to bury the war dead from the Civil War in Robert E. Lee's backyard. That's what we're going to do. So when you look up and see the hill there, that was Robert E. Lee's property. And I walked among these headstones in Arlington National Cemetery, and I was stunned by the fact that there was nothing different about them. You look at them from a distance, they're absolutely identical. And the thing that absolutely, absolutely stunned me was to walk down these rows of headstones and see Major General, a guy who started in World War I, served through the end of the Vietnam War. Next to this guy, a private, who had served 4 months. 18 years old, 69 years old, 73 years old. Here's a colonel, a lot of sergeants out there. And they're all the same. I thought that is just something remarkably decent and good about that. So finally it came time to go to the ceremony. So since we'd had a big ceremony earlier, there were only 11 of us here for this event. We got in a van, and we rode out to the McClellan Arch. It was the coldest day I've ever been in my life. And we got out of that van, and standing at attention in this field, in this cold, cold morning, were 40 men who were about 18 or 19 years old, just exactly about as old as my dad was when he signed up in 1944. By the way, I saw my dad's class picture. He was a second lieutenant in the Army. And on the back of his class picture, there were 30 guys in this class picture, and the question was, what are you going to do after the war? And my dad wrote, I expect to die fighting for my country in Germany. And most of the guys wrote that. They didn't think they were coming back. And so there were 40 men of that age standing at attention in the Army Honor Guard. And standing next to them were another 40 men at attention in the Army band. And because the ashes are in a case about this big, it's kind of anticlimactic to have a horse draw something this big. It's kind of cheesy. So they take these box of ashes and they put it in a silver casket. It just slides into the back of it and the doors close. And the men who are handling this are wearing white gloves, and they're folding the flag, and everything they do is so careful and reverent and respectful, and so perfectly rehearsed. So, we follow this case on out. 11 of us following the lead of these 80 young men, plus horses in a caisson. And the guy who was running the service was issuing commands in a voice so low that I think only the dead could hear him. It was just, and no sound, just the click of drums on the rim of the drums. And I know this sounds like I'm exaggerating, like I'm embellishing the story, but I assure you this is how it happened. We came out from under a crop of trees, and it was an overcast day, and for some reason, the clouds just parted just then, and the sunlight hit. And the brass band in the army just opened up. And it wasn't a dirge, it was a triumphant march. It was the kind of sound that Caesar makes when he comes into Rome. I remember all of the crud in my life just being blown out of me by the horse, just coming off me. And the Reverend, the Major Crisp, who was running the service, talked about William coming to rest with heroes. And that is what fundamentally got me doing what I'm doing, because when that day was over, we got back in the van, and we're getting ready to get in our car, and we looked down the side of the hill at Arlington. And down at the bottom of the hill, I didn't know Washington very well, but down at the bottom of the hill was a very ugly gray-green wall, just like a slab. And I thought, what is that? And I turned to Major Crisp and I said, is that the Pentagon? He said, yep. I said, wow. He said, yeah, wow. That's the side that got hit 13 months ago. I said, really? He said, yeah. I said, did you see it? He said, I was standing on a hill right there. What happened? He says, I was about to conduct a service. We heard through the military that something was going on in New York. We're sitting there in quiet. We're trying to mind our own business. We didn't think anything was going to happen here. We didn't know what was happening in New York. Suddenly I heard a scream and a roar. Thought it was a missile attack. We were sure we were all dead. And I looked up, and about 30 feet above our heads, by the way, 30 feet is about as high as those lights are above you right now. 30 feet above our heads, I just saw this flash of aluminum, kind of like what I saw when I was a little boy. And I watched that plane go right over my head 30 feet and hit that building, and then there was a flash of heat and light. And then after a moment, it started to rain. And what it started to rain was little pieces of aluminum and little pieces of people. They said that the entire lawn at Arlington was covered with little tiny pieces of people. And it took them almost a week to collect them all up. They buried them all in the same place down there. So I had said, from the reading I'd done, I said, are you aware that right now, in October of 2002, the #1 best-selling novel in France says that 9/11 was an inside job that was committed by the United States government against its own people, and that what actually happened here was not a 757 hitting a building, that it was a missile strike? Are you aware of that? He said, no, I was not aware of that. And he said, I'd like to have a word with that guy. I said, I'd like to have a word with him too. Because like so many of the people that are buried here, my father was a man who signed on the dotted line to go to France and help liberate that country. I think they deserve better than that. I think they deserve better than that. And what my dad actually did when he was in Germany, he was an intelligence officer. And he was 19 years old, and his job was to attend the Nuremberg trials and stand underneath the scaffolds with a stopwatch and take track of the amount of time it took for these Nazi war criminals to drop versus the time they stopped kicking and the doctor went in with his stethoscope. That's what he did when he was 19 for the U.S. Army. So, on the plane ride home to Los Angeles coming out of that funeral, I was not the same person I went when I left. And I wrote about this, I wrote a letter about my day, and it was published in a blog, and people said, that's very powerful. I wrote some other stuff. They said, that's very powerful, you should get a blog. I called it Eject, Eject, Eject. And that's how I'm standing here today. That's why I'm here. I'm here to talk to you about civilization. I'm here to talk to you about threats to civilization. I'm here to tell you what I think we can do about some of these threats to civilization. But I thought you might want to know something about me before we got started, because I don't consider this a joke. I don't think this is funny, and I don't think it's trivial. I think there are people buried all over the world, and not just Americans, Canadians too, obviously, all around the world. People who have died for freedom and who have a right to a free country being bequeathed to them. They have a right to it. They paid for it. And I'm not about to let people just piss that away. I'm going to do the best I can. Now, I am a member of the Tea Party in the United States. And I'm well aware of the reputation that the Tea Party has been given by the media. I'm well aware that we're considered a bunch of jingoistic, nationalistic racists. I'm aware of the fact that when they try to show signs of Tea Party and racist Tea Party, they can point to one sign of a picture of Barack Obama with a bone through his nose, which is undeniably racist. But they can only point to one sign. Again and again and again they point to the same sign. So out of 4 or 5 million people at 70 or 80,000 Tea Party rallies over 3 years, they can find one sign. I remember during the Tea Party's ascendancy that there was a group of liberals who determined that they were going to go out and infiltrate Tea Party signs and take racist signs with them to show the world how racist the Tea Party is. Please think about that for a moment. That is an admission that there's no evidence. We're going to have to create evidence to prove the case that we know in our heart is true even though there is no evidence. We're going to have to create the evidence that is not there because we're so sure about things. The way I used to be sure about things when I passionately believed in things I knew nothing about. And I told you I'm a member of Tea Party because there's something I think that you should know about the Tea Party. In the United States, at a Tea Party rally, the one thing that is the most astonishing thing to me and never ceases to amaze me and fill me with pride is that the people I meet at the Tea Party rally are the most remarkably well-educated people I have ever met, at least in one area, and that's the area to me that counts the most. They are tremendously well-educated in what constitutes civilization, what constitutes liberty and freedom, and why it must be defended. Absolutely well-educated in this. And as I was walking through the streets of your magnificent, beautiful, clean, decent, generous city today, I realized that what that knowledge amounts to is, it amounts to a knowledge of the underground structure that lives underneath this city. In other words, you grew up here, you don't even think about it. You walk around, see the beautiful buildings, see the beautiful parks, the incredible civic virtue of this magnificent, wonderful town of yours. And you know that when you go into a building and you press the button on the elevator, electricity is going to take you up to the floor you want to go to. And you know when you go home, you turn on the bath, you turn on the faucet, and water is going to come out. You know these things are going to happen. You don't think about it. But underneath that city, right now, is a series of water pipes and electrical mains and sewer mains. You don't know anything about them. You're not supposed to know anything about them. It's good that you don't know anything about them, but they exist. And what I want to do with you this evening is I want to talk a little bit about some of these underground structures that make this civilization so magnificent, that we take so for granted, that we take utterly for granted, because the pipes down there are not in good shape. And the ruptures and the leaks are pin leaks now, but they're not in good shape. And they need to be understood because they need to be repaired. And if you understand the subterranean structure of your gentle, decent, civilized city, you'll be more willing to get up and defend her when she comes under attack from these forces that want her destroyed, because they do want her destroyed. I'm going to tell you about what some of those forces are, and I'm going to tell you about why they want them destroyed. I said something to that reporter today, and I said it on purpose because I like watching people's reaction when I say this. I said, Western civilization is not only the greatest civilization in the world, it's the greatest civilization in the history of the world, and Western civilization is better than any civilization that has ever existed or exists on this planet today. It is. It's just so. She said, how can you say that? And I realized that she makes the same mistake that so many people that have a problem with that statement. She assumed that when I said Western civilization is better than other civilizations, what she really heard me say was that we're better people than other people, but I didn't say that at all. Because I am actually as far from a racist as you can be. That's an absolute fact. My philosophy tells me that I could take newborn children from the Sudan, raise them to be astronauts and Supreme Court judges, engineers, whatever I want. Likewise, I can take children from the nicest neighborhood in Toronto, ship them out to neighborhoods, and they'll grow up to be terrorists and murderers. I don't think this flesh is anything more than a computer. It's a processor. It's not the hardware. It's the software. It's the software. So while I am a lifelong anti-racist, I am a raging culturalist. And I believe Western civilization is the greatest civilization in the history of the world. And so when I say it's the greatest civilization in the history of the world, that doesn't mean we're good people and they're bad people. It doesn't mean that at all. It just means we have a better system. And when the reporter said, how can you say that? I said, well, you're a woman. How would you like it if I said to you, you don't have a right to ask me questions. You're a woman. What are you doing out of the kitchen? Get back to where you belong. Did you drive here yourself? Lots of places in the world, that's the case. I said, do you like being thought of that way? She said, no. Do you think it's better That you're treated as a human being in Toronto rather than the way you'd be treated in Riyadh? Yes. Then why can't you say this is better? How do you feel about gay people? I've gone up around gay people my whole life in the entertainment business. I think they deserve to be treated with a full spectrum of respect. Doesn't mean they're automatically good people or bad people. They're individuals like everybody else, but they're human beings like everybody else. Here in Toronto and in the United States, there may be some prejudice existing towards these people, but they are legally protected. In Iran, they're strung up by construction cranes. Don't you think it's better that they're not strung up by construction cranes here? Yes. Okay, I agree with you. What about freedom of speech? Don't you like the idea that we can disagree about things and talk about things and try and find the truth and I don't get carted away or you don't get carted away because you said something forbidden? Don't you think that's better? Yes. Don't you like the idea that you can think about things? That you have the freedom to think and speak and act? Where in most of the world you do not have these abilities at all. Don't you think that's better? Well, yes, of course I do. Then why can't you say that this civilization is better than those civilizations? It's better. It's better because it allows humans to become everything that they can possibly be. Why are you so ashamed to say that? Why are you so afraid to say that? And now we're getting down to the real reason that I want to talk to you, because it is the entire idea of civilization that's under attack. I know a lot of people thought I was going to be talking about Syria, and I'll talk a little bit about this, but it's not what I'm here to talk about. It's not a question of the threats to civilization. The danger is that the entire idea of civilization and decency and freedom and potential is under attack. And when you say that it's no different than any other society in the world, you have given up on the essence of what makes us what we are. It's the essence of why people come here. And when you just give it away like that, the game is over before the game begins. We have got to get out of this idea. We have to stop it. We have to understand that the way we treat people is what determines us as a civilization, and no one gets treated better than they do in the West. And that's why the West is the best civilization in the history of the world. And I don't have any problem saying it, because it's true. Because it's true. So why is Western civilization so wonderful? What is it about the West that makes the West so powerful and so astonishing in its history? Well, I think it's actually three things. Excuse me, I'll have to do this during the course of the night. It's thirsty work saving the world. I think you can probably define the West's success and the West's magnificence by looking at three different qualities about Western civilization. And those three different foundations of Western civilization are Judeo-Christian morality, Greco-Roman philosophy, and Anglo-Saxon law. You understand these three foundations, you'll understand why this civilization is unmatched in history and the power of the West. Judeo-Christian morality, what does that mean? Judaism invented the idea of monotheism. A lot of people think, well, what's the big deal? Instead of having 60 gods, you got one God. What difference does it make? I don't believe in God anyway. Well, if there's one God, then there's absolute truth. There's absolute truth. There's not a perspective of potential truths, not a perspective of potential rights, or this was right for me and it might be right for you, or you can do this under certain circumstances. No. There is an author of the universe who has laid out a series of laws, and you either are in compliance with them or you're not. There is absolute right and wrong. There is absolute codes of behavior that you are expected to live up to with the full understanding that nobody lives up to. As a quick parenthetical, one of the things that Republicans and conservatives are often accused of, especially by people in the entertainment media back home where I come from, in Gomorrah, we're often accused of being hypocrites. And they're precisely correct. Of course conservatives are hypocrites. Of course conservatives are hypocrites. We're hypocrites because we have standards that we fail to hold ourselves up to sometimes because we're flawed individuals like everybody else. But we have standards. We have morals that we fall short of. If a Republican or a conservative politician has an affair, he's a hypocrite because he professes that there is a better way to live your life. If Bill Clinton has an affair, he's Bill Clinton. Of course. But see, the thing about Judeo-Christian morality and absolute truth is simply this. If there is, forget about whether you actually believe in a deity, but just look at it as an ingredient in a culture. If there is an absolute truth, then there is absolute right and wrong. And if there's one God, then there is a judge of your behavior. And if you have things like the Ten Commandments that say, thou shalt not, you will not do these barbaric and uncivilized things. You will not murder each other. You will not steal from each other. You will not covet each other's property. You won't bear false witness against each other. You won't do it. What does that actually do to a society? What does it accomplish? Well, it's a multi-step process. But what it really does is, it says that there are truths and commandments, and you are responsible for enforcing them, not the Committee on Public Safety. You are responsible. It's your responsibility to live a virtuous life. So absolute truth means the idea of a conscience. A conscience is a judge that lives within you. It's not a question of, hey, nobody caught me stealing. You caught yourself stealing. You know you stole. If you are aware of this and you become a governor of your own behavior, you develop a quality which we don't hear much about today, but that quality is called virtue. Virtue is the ability for individual people to do the right thing most of the time. And the entire theory of our system of government, meaning the United States, Canada, the Anglosphere, the British system of government, the entire theory of government is that virtuous people can be trusted to rule themselves. They don't need to be governed by other people because they govern themselves. And the more virtuous a people are, the more freedoms they can be given, because rather than having a police force or a priesthood constantly evaluating and determining their behavior, they'll do it on their own. So Judeo-Christian morality is essential to the idea of a democracy and a republic, because without it there is no truth. Without no truth there is no conscience for violating the truth. Without no conscience there is no virtue. And without any virtue there is no freedom. You don't deserve freedom if you don't have virtue. That's why there's no freedom in the world. That's why there's no freedom among these societies. If you look at Islam as an example, I'm not here to demonize Islam tonight. I have a lot to say about Islam, but I'm not here to specifically demonize Islam. But if you look at Islam as an example of religions that split from Abraham, one religion, Judaism, being the religion descended from the free child, Islam is descended from Ishmael, is descended from the slave child. And if you think about it, Islam treats its citizens, under Sharia anyway, as slaves. It takes all of these things off the table. It doesn't say we expect you not to gamble or to whore around or to drink. We're not going to allow you. We're not going to give you the option. We don't treat you like an adult with a conscience. We're going to take these things off the table. Okay. Okay. That's the deal. Judeo-Christian morality. Greco-Roman philosophy, what does that mean? Greco-Roman philosophy is actually very simple. Greco-Roman philosophy explains for the tremendous material power of Western civilization, the astonishing command over nature that Western civilization has, from things like airplanes to antibiotics, MRI machines, and of course, I think the ubiquitous, and I'll pull it out, the miracle of the age, this little thing, the iPhone. This is the most amazing device, in my opinion, the most amazing device I've ever seen. This is a product of Greco-Roman philosophy. And it's only a product of Greco-Roman philosophy because it was the Greeks and the Romans that came up with the idea that the universe is not chaotic and arbitrary and at the whim of various river gods and ocean gods at war with each other all the time. The Greeks and the Romans believed that the universe was understandable, that there were laws at work that were beyond the ability to interfere, and that it was up to us to figure out what these laws were. And if we developed a way of looking at the universe, which eventually became known as science, we might be able to interrogate nature. We might be able to isolate these laws. And once we isolated those laws, we could wield those laws. And once you can wield the laws of nature, then civilization has a chance to really get on the escalator. Greco-Roman philosophy tells us that the world is knowable and predictable. And if it's knowable and predictable, we can bend it to our wills. We can make nature serve us instead of us being slaves to nature. We can have devices that allow me to talk to anybody in the world. It allows me to have access to the information base of the entire species. Every single thing that's ever been understood, written down, every single scientific breakthrough, every little piece of literature is available to me in my hand because of Greco-Roman philosophy and Western civilization. If I want to start a business and I need Venetian blinds from China, I can have these products on their way from this podium right now. It's astonishing. It's astonishing. The third thing that we base our civilization on is the idea of Anglo-Saxon law. Anglo-Saxon law is unlike any other kind of law in the world. In the United States, the entire purpose of the United States, the entire Declaration of Independence, is the idea founded in Anglo-Saxon law that there is such a thing as natural law, that there is a law above the laws of men, that there is a law of God. You don't have to believe in God, but that there is a common law, that there is a law above political law that we all share. For instance, there's not a person on this earth that wants to be murdered. There's not a father or a mother on this earth that wants to see their daughters raped. There's not a person on the world that wants to have their hard-earned property taken from them. Not one. Natural law says that these are universal truths. And natural law says that natural law trumps political law. So in the United States, the Declaration of Independence is a proclamation to the world saying, we are about to break the law. We're about to break the law. We are King George's property. But we're going to break the law. Because we believe that natural law tells us that we have the right to govern ourselves, that self-determination trumps political affiliation. And so the entire Declaration of Independence is an appeal to the world saying we are appealing to higher law, to natural law. This is the foundation of Anglo-Saxon law. And the reason it's so important is because, again, there are many similarities between Canada and the United States, and I'm just going to speak about what I know, which is the American situation. Many people in America think that our First Amendment rights are protected by the Constitution, that the right to free speech is given to us by our Constitution. Categorically false. What the American system says is that the right to free speech is inherent in you at birth. And all the First Amendment does is say the government can't take it away from you. If as a result of Anglo-Saxon law you understand that your human rights are in you the instant you enter this world and cannot be given to you by anybody and therefore can't be taken away from you by anybody, you completely invert the centuries and millennia of authority that have kept the individual human perspective down. Because natural law says that we are all kings and emperors, all of us, and that the government didn't give us these rights. They came when we arrived. And that unleashes the human potential. And so the combination of Judeo-Christian morality, Greco-Roman philosophy, and Anglo-Saxon law, things like property rights, political protections, the fact that the king or the governor or the chief executive have to follow the same laws as we do, is the underpinning of the Western civilization idea, which we all share. And the ultimate reason we are as powerful as we are is because all three of these things go together to unleash human potential. Unleash the ability for all of us to become as fully human as we possibly can. That's why we're so powerful and so successful. So the question becomes, if we're so powerful and so successful, why does it feel like everything's about to end? Why do we feel like we're in the end days? Why does Israel have such a problem and the United States and Canada have such a problem defending themselves? Well, in order to really understand this, I think what we have to do is take a look at some of these threats from without. Because it's only by understanding the outer threats where we can really understand where the true problem lies. Do you ever wonder why there's such a burning hatred towards the West, and I'm speaking here mostly the United States and also of Israel, why there's such burning hatred towards these countries when there's no similar hatred towards Germany or France or any of these other countries? Why? Why do they hate us so much, do you think? U.S. and Israel are very similar, and the reason I think that Israel is so profoundly hated in the Middle East is because they're so much like our culture, except they're closer. What am I trying to say here? Well, in Islam, in the countries of the Middle East, they're taught, thank you, they're taught that, as all religions teach, that they're God's chosen people, and they're given a series of brutal constraints on their behavior. I mean brutal constraints. In these Islamic countries with fundamental Islam, with Sharia, men and women don't get to go out on dates. When you're a teenager, you don't get to go in a car, drive around, and make out behind the football stadium. You just simply can't. You can't. You can't do anything fun. You're not allowed to do anything human or fun. You can't sing, you can't dance, you can't kiss, you can't hold hands. You can't do it. You're not allowed. That's repressive. And the only thing that allows you to come to grips with this is the idea that this is what God wants for you, and if you follow these rules, then you'll be successful. Meanwhile, on the other side of planet Earth sits Las Vegas, Nevada, where human beings break every single one of these strictures with the wildest abandon, commit every sin known to man. They look at us and see all of our sins. They see all of our sins because we broadcast our sins. And they look at us sinning over here, and they look at the quality of the lives we lead. That'd drive anybody crazy, right? It would drive anybody crazy to watch people do everything that you're forbidden to do and live a life of such splendor, such magnificence, of such opulence and such security and such prosperity and freedom. Got a chance to make it with the prom queen. And I violated every law that Allah laid out in front of us. That's virtually intolerable. It's virtually intolerable when it's on the far side of the world. But when it's on the other side of the valley you live in, it's completely intolerable. It's completely intolerable. The reason I believe that Israel is so profoundly hated by the Arab countries that surround it is because Israel is a Western country. It's a product of Western civilization, and they have the audacity, they have the unmitigated gall to succeed in the very desert where they failed for thousands of years. That is a profoundly troubling thing to think about, isn't it? Think about how awful that must be for them. Because even if you go back to biblical times, you find that even in the history of the Bible, where the Israelites had marched through a territory and slaughtered, and Joshua was burning and raping and doing what Joshua did, even then the Israelis were building wells. And as soon as the Israelis moved out, I'm talking about biblical times now. I'm talking about 1,000 years BC. As soon as the Israeli army moved out, the first thing that the Palestinians did, the first thing that those people did was they filled in the wells. They filled them full of sand. Didn't that happen not too long ago? When they turned over, I forget if it was either the West Bank or the Gaza Strip, and they had all these wonderful greenhouses. Perfect Gaza, yeah. Functioning greenhouses, where in the desert you're growing oranges and lemons and tomatoes and stuff. And what's the first thing they did? They smashed the glass. You can argue, and I'm not here to tell you who's right or wrong in this situation, because this is an all-night topic, but you could argue that the Palestinians could have a right to that land. I don't think they do. It's my personal opinion, but let's say that you believe that they did. And let's say that turning Gaza back over to them was an act of justice. Let's just say that you believe that. How do you explain that? How do you explain it? It's envy. It's envy. And it's envy of success. And what it really means is the countries that surround Israel are faced with a choice. It is unbearable and intolerable to watch them succeed in the same desert where they failed. My mom is a British subject, and she grew up in Egypt and Malta, and she told me as a very young boy, I was 7 or 8 years old, she said, when you go and visit Israel, this was in the late 50s when she said, you can stand on a hill and look down, and it's like somebody drew on the desert with a razor. This side is green, this side is brown. It's because the Western mind has the ability to visualize things that aren't there. In the Bridge Over the River Kwai, the book that the movie was based on, the author, Pierre Buell, wrote about something that really stayed with me. And he said the reason that the British bridge, the Western bridge, was such a magnificent piece of work, while the Japanese had just gone out into the jungle and lashed bamboo together, and the train goes over 2 or 3 times and it falls down, they lash some more bamboo, they falls down again, lash some more bamboo, falls down again. That's the third world, right? But the reason the British bridge was so magnificent, Buell writes, was because the British built the bridge in their minds. They built the bridge in their heads before they ever went out there. They built the bridge in their heads. They did tests to see how much weight the sandy ground could support. They had measurements for how much wood they'd need and how much binding and how much cross braces and structure. They had engineers working on the reports. They built in a tolerance for failure. They had to figure out which crews had to go out in what order, where we're going to get the resources, how are the teams going to work, who goes out there first, surveyors first, then the guys that do the flooring. And they didn't actually go and build the bridge until the bridge in their mind was complete and tested and criticized and redesigned and rebuilt again. Then they went out and built the bridge. And that's precisely what Israel does, because Israel is a product of Western civilization. Israel can look at a desert and say, it's an orchard. It's an orchard. All we need is a couple of pipes, a pump, some electricity, and it's an orchard. And this is not a racial distinction. You could take any of these Arabs and raise them in Israel as Israelis, and they'll see the orchard too. It's the culture. It's the civilization. And so what this does, this orchard in the desert, is it presents Israel's enemy with a choice of 2 possible paths. Well, 3. One of them is intolerable. The intolerable path is to be reminded of your failure on a daily basis. That's intolerable. That's intolerable for anybody. So the 2 choices remaining are to do the hard work that it takes to make an orchard in the desert, or to destroy the orchard. And one of these is easier than the other. And that's why they do what they do. Because one of them is easier than the other. It's easier to sit in Cairo and get up in the morning whenever you want to, because you don't have a job, go down to the coffee shop, sip your coffee, talk about the goddamn Israelis and the goddamn Americans and all of this sin and all of this stuff, and wish them dead. That's easier than it is to go out and build wells and greenhouses, isn't it? That's the choice they make. That's their choice. And unlike many people, I don't view people who are our adversaries as subhumans. What do I mean by that? I think the liberal viewpoint certainly is that these people are not fully human. In other words, they're not capable of their own motivations. They don't have their own motivations. They're not fully formed the way that we are in our hot tubs with our Chardonnay. So everything that they do in the world is a result of us. If we would stop doing this, they'd do something different. I don't believe that. I believe they have their own ambitions. I believe their own motivations, and I take them at their word. When they say they want to kill us, I believe them. I'm not afraid of that. I'm more afraid of pretending that's not true. So, where does this leave Israel? America, because of its size and its distance, is immune to some of these dangers that can consume Israel, that cannot consume America. So let's talk about Israel for a moment. When Iran describes Israel as a cancer on humanity, that's just the envy talking. That's the envy and the failure talking. But when they say things like Israel is a one-bomb state, now you're in a whole different category, aren't you? Because now, you're not talking about just unfocused rage and unfocused anger and unfocused energy and unfocused failure. When Iran officially says that Israel is a one-bomb state, meaning all we need is an atomic bomb over Tel Aviv and Israel's finished because Israel is so tiny. And Israel will retaliate. Maybe they'll retaliate with 500 nuclear weapons and maybe we'll lose 1 million people. We don't care. We've got 30 million. We've got too many people to feed, too many people to give jobs to anyway. Once you understand that that is what you're up against, you now have two choices. Before I told you about the choices that the Arabs had, looking at the situation. Do you either change or do you destroy it? Now we have two choices to make. Do we believe them or do we pretend they're not that they're kidding? Do we believe them when they say it's a one-bomb state? Do we believe them when they say they're going to destroy the big Satan as well as the little Satan? Do we take them at their word because we feel that they're fully human beings just like all of us and have strategies and designs just as we do? Or do we pretend that they're just saying that for their gin up their own populations? I have the moral courage to take them at their word. I have the respect for them as human beings to take them at their word. And if you take them at their word, you realize that the situation that Israel faces with Iran is very different than the situation that deterrence has worked for so many years against so many different adversaries. Let's look at the Cold War. The United States had 22,000 nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union had 25,000 nuclear weapons. These were hydrogen weapons that had thousands of times the yield of the little atomic weapons that we're talking about here. But we could deal with the Soviets in terms of deterrence because the Soviets had the capability. They had the capability when the game begins. We had to determine their intent. And because they were fundamentally civilized people, because they had a belief in their future and their children and so on, we could understand that they would get that if we had 22,000 nuclear weapons and they had 22,000 nuclear weapons, ain't nobody pulling a trigger on the other guy without both people going down dead. That's why the Cold War fundamentally worked. That's why we're not all speaking Russian now. That's why they collapsed, because that's all they had. But when you're dealing with Iran, or Syria, or any of these other guys, it's no longer a question of capability. They want this. The second they get the capability, I believe they're going to use it. We can't allow them to get that capability. So why do we allow it? Why? Why do we allow them? You know, my country was attacked by Iran in 1979, and while we've never been at war with Iran, Iran's been at war with the United States since 1979. All of these things are the result of Iranian influence. You have the source of Shia terrorism in Iran, and you have the source of Sunni terrorism in Saudi Arabia. These countries have been at war with my country for 20, 30 years now, 40 years. We pretend like it doesn't happen, pretend like it's not there. We bury our heads in the sand. Why? Because we're decent, good, morally advanced people. That's why. We don't believe that they're really serious about it, but they are. And you can go and visit Lower Manhattan to find out how serious they actually are. And if we don't do something, you'll be able to visit what used to be Tel Aviv and find out how serious they are. Right? So why don't we stop them? We don't stop them because we don't believe in this civilization. Certainly our rulers don't. They don't believe in it. They don't have faith in it. They don't have confidence in it. They're not proud of it. And so we can talk about things like Iran's nuclear program. We can talk about Egypt, which has a population, I think, probably greater than the rest of the Arab countries combined. Cairo is I think, more population than I think the next 6 Arab cities combined. It's the home of the Muslim Brotherhood. It's the ideological center of this ideology of failure and envy. I have a good friend named Sim Farah, and she's a very liberal Egyptian, beautiful woman, who was in Tahrir Square during the Arab Spring there. And she got on Facebook and Twitter when they were having the revolution and Mubarak was going down, and she had tears in her eyes saying, they're ringing the Christian bells. They're ringing the bells in the Christian churches. The people have taken over from the dictatorship, and all will be well. We're going to live in a pluralistic society. Well, she's not in Egypt anymore, because if she went back to Egypt, she'd be killed. She wouldn't be killed first, of course, but she'd be killed. She's now a permanent refugee in the West, where that opinion and the ability of a beautiful woman to have an opinion and speak it openly is still protected. She's not there anymore. Egypt is going to go the way of these other fundamentalist countries. And of all the things I see sometimes, I think the thing that's the most heartbreaking to me is I saw a travel brochure from about 1961 for Trans World Airlines, and it said, visit beautiful Baghdad. And it was a paradise. And people were driving modern cars, and they were jets, and everybody was very Western. It all fell apart. Why did it fall apart? It fell apart because we didn't take it seriously. We didn't understand that the 1979 Iranian Revolution was a declaration of war against the West. If I was president of the United States, I'll tell you what I would say. In the war in Iraq, which you don't have to support, I did, but you don't have to. The fact remains that of the 4,000 casualties that we took in our army in Iraq, almost all of them were killed by IEDs that were either designed by, supplied by, built by, or detonated by Iranians. If I was the president of the United States, I would say to Iran, we didn't build 13 carrier groups for photo opportunities. The next time an American is killed that can be conclusively tied to Iranian activity, Iran is going to lose an installation, a military installation. It's going to disappear. And we're not going to send in tanks. We're not going to lose any guys doing it. It's just going to go away. And every time you kill an American soldier, we're going to lose another installation. We understand what you're up to. We know who you are. We take you at your word. If you want to join the community of nations, we'd be happy to trade with you. We trade with a lot of people. But we are going to take you at your word. And we're not going to sit here and continually give you signal after signal after signal after signal for 40 years that we have a death wish and we don't care to defend ourselves. You do this 3 times and the problem goes away. But no one does it because they don't have the will. They don't have the belief in the civilization. So I can talk to you all day about external threats to the great city, the civilization. I can talk to you about Iran, I can talk to you about Egypt, I can talk about a runaway resurgent Russia, I can talk to you about China getting adventurous. We can talk about global warming, we can talk about holes in the ozone layer, plagues of frogs, or asteroid impacts, and I don't care about any of these things. These things do not worry me. They're serious threats, they're potent threats, and they need to be taken seriously, but they are not civilization-ending threats. No threats to a civilization from exterior, from beyond the walls of the city, can ever bring down a civilization that's at the height of its powers. It's never happened in history. Civilizations fall from within. This is what scares me today. This is what makes me think about those men in Arlington. The collapse that comes from within. So that's what I want to spend the rest of the evening talking to you about the real threat to civilization. And it's not from Iran, and it's not from Russia, and it's not from China. It's from within. You know, if you look at history, not American history, not Western history, look at history, deep history, and you look at the path of civilizations in Dark Ages, you realize that it's very, very much like a heartbeat, that the pattern is virtually identical. Virtually identical. A slow and gradual rise to power, competition with other city-states. The competition drives a sense of patriotism and purpose and sacrifice. This increases the power of the civilization. Its mercantile trade spreads all over the world, generates enough wealth to provide an army. The citizens of those republics or those cities believe in them and are ready to die for them. And then the civilization reaches the height of its powers. And when the civilization is at the height of its powers, looking back through the telescope of history, the collapse that happens almost overnight. It's virtually like a strobe light. It's almost instantaneous. But it's always the same, and it's always from within. Babylon, the rise and fall, was identical to the rise and fall of the Egyptian Empire, which was identical to the rise and fall of Athens and Sparta, which was identical to the rise and fall of Rome, which was identical to the rise and fall of the Ottomans, which was identical to the rise and fall of the Spanish and the French and the British. And now you look at America and the West, and you see that we are in a rather ripe place. A rather ripe or overripe place on this cycle of civilization. If that doesn't scare you, it ought to, because it scares me very, very, very badly. But you have to understand that no one could defeat the Roman Empire at the height of the Roman Empire's power but the Romans. No one can defeat America militarily. No one can defeat the combined powers of the West militarily. No one can defeat them, and we all know it. The rest of the world talks about American militarism and all of these other things, but the world has not seen America really angry since 1945. If Western civilization ever gets fully angry and uses all of its powers, these external threats are over in 48 hours, and we all know it. Civilizations fall from within. And the way to think about this is very simple. The way to think about this is to think of the fact that common citizens, common people like you and me, throughout history, have stood on the walls of these cities and been prepared to defend them with our lives. And every single time, while we man the battlements, some silk-robed son of a bitch comes out of the palace at midnight and opens the doors, and the city falls from within. It's always that way. Always that way. And that's where the real threat is. That's where the real danger is. We have to understand this threat and this danger. We have to make this our mission in life, to understand it, because this civilization is worth protecting. Civilizations rot from the top down. Why? Why? Why do civilizations fall? Why do they become to the height of their powers? Why is it that when they are the least challenged, when they're the most dominant, that's the fatal moment? Why is that? Well, let's take a look at our civilization, because our civilization is something we can relate to, but this has happened throughout all of these previous cycles. It happens because a civilization at the height of its power goes from being exponential to becoming asymptotic. What does that mean? Well, exponential growth in the quality of life is pretty simple to understand. Every year that goes by, the quality of living increases, and as a civilization grows in its powers, the increase accelerates. The changes in the quality of life during the 20th century for Western civilization they're simply mind-boggling. They're simply mind-boggling. My grandmother saw Hindenburg over in New York City. She saw the Wright brothers, read about them in the newspaper. She lived to see men walk on the moon. That's an exponential growth in the quality of life. But as civilizations begin to reach the height of their powers, this growth rate is unsustainable, and the growth rate not only just starts to level off, it becomes asymptotic. Asymptotic growth means that over time, the increase keeps going, but it becomes smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. So let's take a look at today's millennial generation, these poor kids that seem so badly lost out there today. They have no faith in themselves and no faith in their civilization. Why? They're given everything. Why are they so full of despair? Well, they're full of despair because they're trapped under the asymptote of prosperity. What does that mean? Well, my grandfather came to the United States from England in 1915, and he was descended from a long line of cotton mill workers. My family is from a mill town called Wigan in northwestern England, near Lancashire. Before that, they were coal miners. So if my grandfather worked very, very hard for his entire life, he might bring electricity and running water into his house. And his work would produce a remarkable improvement in the quality of his life. He had something to be proud of. He had a goal. He had ambition. And he saw the immediate, tangible benefits of hard work and discipline. Kids who are entering the job market today have never been hungry one day in their lives. Never been hungry. They've never been in pain for more than the amount of time it takes to get them to the hospital, and that's not very common. They've had 24-hour access to the world's information supplies. They've had 24-hour access to the best entertainment that's ever been provided. This is what they start with. Air conditioning, widescreen TVs, Xboxes, and iPhones. Where do you go from there? Where do you go from there? 2 iPhones? 3 widescreen TVs? Is it any wonder that as we get trapped in the asymptote of the success of our society, that people feel like they're bored? And that maybe the only thing left of any interest is a little bit of chaos and a little bit of destruction and a little bit of suicide? We have kids cutting themselves because they're so bored. They've got everything. They've got everything. They just slice themselves up with razor blades. To feel something, they're trapped under the asymptote of our success. And all of these generations were the same. You know, the British Empire reached its peak. Certainly was at its peak during World War I. Britain suffered such catastrophic losses in World War I and World War II, you can't take the best of a generation twice and expect that culture to survive. But right after World War I, during the Oxford Debate Societies, or maybe it was at Eton, I think it was at Oxford, the resolution was, we will not go and fight for king and country. The resolution passed overwhelmingly. This is the cream of British society, saying we're not going to fight for the civilization anymore. It's always the same, right? It's always the same. It's always the same way. We're trapped under the asymptote. You know, there's a guy out there who wrote a book called The Great Leap. I think it's not The Great Leap Forward. I actually forget the name of the book, but he has a theory called the upper limit problem. And he basically says that human beings have many survival characteristics that have aided us throughout our history, and they confer an evolutionary advantage. And one of those advantages is worry. Makes sense to me, actually. If you have a cave full of proto-humans that are worried, and another cave full of proto-humans that don't have that worry gene, and the worrying humans say, maybe we ought to keep a fire going all night and keep a lookout because there are leopards out there, and the other guys go, what's the worst that could happen? Well, then that tribe becomes dinner, and they don't pass on that lack of worry gene, and the people that do worry enough to survive, survive. So we have to start asking ourselves if this built-in survival strategy of worry and constant anxiety is not being turned against ourselves. You know, an immune system's purpose is to look inside the body, find alien invaders, and destroy them. But when there's not enough dirt in a society, like in these sanitized skyscrapers in New York, allergies are hundreds of times higher among kids who are raised in New York City skyscrapers than they are on kids raised in farms in America today. You know why? Because there's no dirt. Their bodies don't know what dirt is. And so the immune system starts attacking itself. That's what an allergic reaction is, when the immune system attacks its own tissues. The West is suffering a vast, enormous allergic reaction to itself because we've eliminated threats. We have an upper limit problem. And so what I'm really trying to do with you tonight is to not only show you how wonderful this society is and why it needs to be protected, but to show you what these immune system responses look like. What do they physically look like out in the world? What do we need to be watching out for, and what do we need to understand? So let's talk about why the civilization needs to be defended. First of all, it needs to be defended because it is a rule of law. Why do people come to the West? Why do they come to Canada? Why do they immigrate to Toronto or to the United States? Why? What are they coming from? Well, they're usually running from either political repression or economic chaos, often both, because they usually go together. What are they seeking? They're seeking law. They're seeking order and law and structure and fairness. These are qualities that our civilization has. These are valuable qualities, and they need to be protected. The idea that the law applies to everyone is what makes Toronto, Toronto, and not Cairo. There's law here, and the law will be enforced, and the law will be enforced equally among everybody. That's why people want to come here, to come to a system of law and order. It's got nothing to do with social services. It's got to do with law. I grew up in Florida, and I grew up in the beach down there, spent a lot of time on the beach, and in all the years I ever spent in Florida, I never once saw a dentist drive down to the beach and take his family, his aged grandmother and his little kids and his daughter and his wife, strap a couple of inner tubes together, mount a lawn chair to it, and set off to sail south 90 miles to Cuba to get the free health care. I never saw that happen once. I've been to Guantanamo Bay twice, and flying over the Straits of Florida, the 90 miles that separate Cuba and Florida, you realize just how much ocean there is there. Don't you find it interesting? People who say that it's all about the social services, don't you find it interesting that with all of the social services and the universal health care and the universal literacy that they have in Cuba, the people are ready to get their babies and their grandmothers on inner tubes and float 90 miles to come to freedom and law? And don't you find it interesting? I find it very interesting that this is not my opinion as a conservative. Don't you find it interesting that this is actually true? And don't you find it interesting that it's not like it's 60% of the rafts coming this way and 40% going that way, and it's not like it's 80% of the rafts going this way or 20% going that way. It's not like it's 90-10, and it's not like it's 95-5, and it's not like it's 99-1. 100% of the people that risk their lives to cross those 90 miles of shark-infested water, 100% of the thousands of them are coming this way. No one's going that way. Not one person has ever been shot climbing the Berlin Wall to get into East Berlin. Not one. Ever. Why? They have social services there. It's the law. It's the structure. It's the rule of law. This has to be defended. It has to be. Because people are dying to get to it. We take it for granted. It's the underground city I told you about. You have to see it. You have to see it with your eyes. You have to go out every day and understand that when we were coming in here today, the person who's been taking such good care of me, Sean, had a cell phone call, and he took the call, and a policeman came by and rolled down the window. We rolled down the window and said, "You're not allowed to speak on the cell phone. The call's an accident. I'm terribly sorry." Off he went. Would have resulted in gunfire in Los Angeles, but here anyway, that's what happened. That's the rule of law. So when you see law being enforced in your city and in your country, you should feel a burst of pride. Constantly. You should never forget it. Ever. People die for this. And not just themselves. They don't risk their own lives. Because when I flew over the Straits of Florida going to Cuba and I saw all of that ocean, I said, despite the fact that thousands and thousands and thousands of Cubans have taken that risk to come to America, thousands of Cubans have been swept out to sea by the Gulf Stream, which runs all the way up to Great Britain, finally. Never seen again. They didn't die a quick death. Grandma died of exposure over 3 days. Little baby slipped away from the raft and drowned in front of your eyes. Your wife was eaten by a shark. To come to law. We sit here and take this for granted. Don't ever do that again. See the underground structure of your civilization. Understand that people who are as human as you are die for these things. They die for them. How awful, how ashamed of ourselves we must be, or should be, anyway, that we don't go and look at what that police officer did today and say, my God, people die for this. Simple thing like this, they die for it. That's one reason the civilization is worth defending. Another reason the civilization is worth defending is because of prosperity. Economic prosperity, material wealth and riches. These are roundly condemned. The capitalist system that creates this wealth is roundly condemned by the enemies of this civilization as immoral and evil and wrong. Let me tell you something I tell audiences back home. I'm generalizing, and because I'm generalizing, there will be exceptions, but as a general rule. In America, anyway, the difference between liberals and conservatives goes something like this. Liberals think that a guy with a $20 million jet is a villain because he has taken $20 million of wealth out of a system. And since he took $20 million for his own selfish needs for his jet, that means somebody doesn't go to school, kid doesn't get a vaccination shot or health care. He took it. He took more than his fair share. That makes him a villain. Conservatives believe that this guy has created enough wealth so that he's able to retain a small sliver of the total wealth that he created for everybody in terms of salaries and products like the iPhone. And the $20 million is his small sliver of reward for all the total wealth he's created. And since he's generated so much wealth for so many people, he's not only not a villain, he's a hero. And so the question becomes, who's right? And the answer to that question comes to the idea of whether or not wealth can be created or not. Can wealth be created out of thin air? Yes or no? Because if the answer is no, then prosperity is wrong, and rich people and businessmen are villains. But if wealth can be created out of thin air, then prosperity is great, because as much prosperity as you want, you just go out and make it, and you don't take somebody else's prosperity to make your own. So which one is it? Well, if you get on Google and you Google Los Angeles, California, 1863, you'll see 3 adobe huts and a hedging post. And I drove past that downtown on the way to the airport. It's improved somewhat since then. So the question I have for you is, where did all this stuff come from? Where did the Mercedes-Benzes and the MRIs and the elevators and the widescreen TVs and the microwave ovens and the hair dryers and the digital watches and the iPhones and the iPads and all this stuff, where did all that stuff come from? It was generated out of thin air. Prosperity and wealth can be generated out of thin air, and the West is successful because it understands how this happens. So many of us take this underground city that I refer to for granted that I have to spend a moment explaining this to you, because the great single stake that is constantly being driven through the heart of Western civilization is our own prosperity, which is referred to as fortune. We're very fortunate people, you know. People in other countries are not as fortunate as we are. The fortune fairy landed in North America, but didn't visit Africa. I know it sounds flip. It's not flip. It's a tragedy, because it's got nothing to do with fortune. If it were fortune, if it were luck, that'd be something to be ashamed of. Not ashamed of, but at least feel guilty about. They got something, we got something. How come they didn't get something? If it's fortune, we should probably share it with them. But if it's reward, if it is the product of generations of hard work and discipline and savings and invention and study in schools, if it is a reward for work, there's nothing fortunate about it. If it's a reward for work, and then the rewards are distributed equally among people that don't do equal amounts of work, that is injustice. And this is how we learn to hate our own civilization, by using words like we're very fortunate. We're not very fortunate. We're very hardworking. We're very hardworking. We're very disciplined. We're very committed to education and improving our lives. We get up every morning and go to work every day, and we generate wealth every day. How do we do that? Well, there's 3 ways that we can generate wealth. First way you can generate wealth is just through the simple act of creation. If I have a $1 piece of paper and a $1 pen, and I write a screenplay, let's say I write Weekends at Bernie's 2, Bernie's Revenge, and Hollywood buys it for $1 million, that's $1 million of wealth that was generated. It wasn't there before. It doesn't have to be anything that obvious as a poem or a sonnet or something, or a song that people will pay for. It could be a business plan for a dry cleaning shop. It could be a sketch for a building that doesn't exist. Anytime the human mind creates something in its head, like the bridge that I talked about, creates a bridge in its head and makes it happen in the real world, you've generated wealth. That wasn't there before. Where there's a gas station or a dry cleaners where there used to be an empty lot, you have increased the total wealth of the world. That's more valuable than it used to be. You have used a Western expression, you've made some money. Wealth is different than money. Money is a method of exchange. You can print money, but you can only generate wealth. Now, the toughest job I ever had was a hard thing for me to understand where I generated wealth, because the worst job I ever had was as a temp when I worked in Los Angeles, and they took me to the back of an insurance company, and they gave me, remember those old computer printouts with the green and white and the sprockets down the side, these gigantic, huge computer printouts? They gave me a book about that thick and another book about that thick, and this woman who worked for the insurance agency said, "This is a list of people who filed a complaint, and this is a list of checks that were issued in response to that complaint. And I want you to go through this list and make sure that everybody's got a complaint, got a corresponding check, and I want you to check it off." I could only do that for about 15 minutes, and then I quit, and that was the end of my temp agency work. But many, many years after that, I said to myself, they were paying me $7 an hour for that. Why would they do that? What wealth did I create for that company? And I realized that a checklist is more valuable than an unchecked list. Because for $7 an hour, they were making sure that customers were being happy. And if I hadn't checked that list and somebody had missed their check payment, that person's going to get irate. Instead of talking to a $7 an hour guy, they're going to talk to a $100 an hour manager. Or they're going to take their business elsewhere, and that company's going to lose $50,000 or $100,000 over the course of that person's life. Of course I generated wealth for that company. If I just alphabetized the list, I had generated some wealth for that company. So wealth can be created by adding complexity. If you dig a ditch in order to lay a conduit for electricity, you've generated some wealth. You've made society a little bit more complex, more valuable. But the main way we generate wealth, and this is something I think probably all the things I'd like to say tonight, I'd like you to remember this the most, because wealth generation, wealth creation is the essence of the entire argument. The way we really generate wealth is through trade, and our economy has become so complex. We live in a web of trust where I get on an airplane, and it's not just a question of who built my airplane, but who's the person that did the engraving on the stewardess's name tag, and who put the dye in the chemicals that make the carpet that goes down the aisle, and who's the guy that manufactured the handle on the restroom, how many thousands or millions or billions of people had to cooperate, how many air traffic controllers are, who's the guy who laid the cement at the navigational beacon that we flew across the country with for that little lake, who did that? It's a web of trust that people all share. We all do our little bit. It's a miracle. Nobody thinks about it, but it's a miracle. So let's eliminate this giant web and get down to the brass tacks of trade and how trade generates wealth. So in order to understand trade, the best way to do that is simply this. Let's imagine that there are 2 tribes of people back in the ancient days before there's any kind of writing and so on. They're just 2 different tribes of people off on a coast somewhere, some unknown country. There's a hunter tribe that lives up in the mountains, and they make their living by hunting, needless to say. That's why we call them a hunter tribe. And because they're hunters, they have to be good at things that were required of hunters. Namely, they have to build superior spears. And they do build superior spears, because that's all they do. They build spears. So the hunter tribe creates a series of spears that are absolutely toughened by fire, and they're straight as an arrow, and they're strong as almost as steel. They've got a fantastic stone spearhead. You throw them, they fly accurately, and they bring down a mammoth. They're the best spears on the earth. But they don't do a lot of gathering, so the baskets they have look kind of like birds' nests. Now, meanwhile, down on the coastline is a gatherer tribe. They do a little bit of hunting in the water with fishing. So their spears are basically just wobbly sticks. They put a little edge on them. They're crap. But they gather all the time, so their baskets are woven tight enough to hold water. Now, one day, a guy from the hunter tribe meets a guy from the gatherer tribe. They meet in the Midlands. They stand there looking at each other, assuming they don't kill each other with rocks or stones or whatever, assuming to get past that initial conflict. The guy with the spear looks at the guy who's from the gatherer tribe and basically says, that is, without question, the nicest basket I've ever seen in my life. And the guy with the basket says, well, I have to say, sir, that is an extraordinary spear. Bing. What if I give you my excellent spear in exchange for your remarkable basket? Done. So they trade, and then they both go home. Here's the miracle. Which one goes home richer? They both do. They both do. They both go home richer. They both go home wealthier. Because they both go home with something that is more valuable to them than the people around them. Trade does not, despite what you're told about capitalism and what you're told about businesses and corporations, trade is not a win-lose argument. The reason that Los Angeles has skyscrapers and Toronto has these incredible glass buildings and all of the cars and all of the MRIs and computers and iPhones, the reason Toronto has it and the reason that Cairo doesn't is because we understand that trade has to be a win-win situation. Both parties are richer on a trade. You can go to McDonald's and give them $2.50 and get a hamburger. And McDonald's would rather have the $2.50 and you'd rather have the hamburger. You both go home with what you want. Now, what does that actually mean in terms of money and wealth? What are the consequences of trade? Well, the guy who comes back to his village, goes back to the hunter village, he's got the world's greatest basket. What a basket. He walks through town, he's the center of attention. The guy's got half a brain, he'll say, ladies, we'll be doing a private showing of the basket this evening at about 11 o'clock. You can just line up outside the cave and I'll show you a little bit of the basket under the moonlight and we can maybe have a little talk. So this man becomes popular and he becomes respected and he's got something that other people want and maybe they'll trade him shiny stones for the basket. Now if the guy is a liberal, he'll keep the basket on a rock and he'll show it off and it'll be a family heirloom and eventually it'll deteriorate. But if he's a conservative, he'll say, wait a minute. I need to make 2 spears a day in order to do what I do. But if I get up an hour earlier than I would normally tomorrow, I bet I can make an extra spear. And I bet if I stay awake an hour or 2 later at the end of the day when I would normally go to bed, I can make another spear too. That's 2 extra spears. That's 2 spears more than I need. Then I can take those 2 spears back down to the guy who's making baskets, and I come back with 2 more baskets. And then he realizes, you know what? My daughter's not going to starve after all, because I can have my idiot son-in-law make the spears and I'll supervise. And so that's what he does, because you see the reward. The reward that comes to him by having the valuable basket motivates him to do more work than he needs in order to survive. This is the essence of capitalism. It's the essence of the profit motive of the reward system. It motivates more work than you need to survive. And the reason the Soviet Union is not here anymore is because that motivation was not here. It's gone. It collapsed. Humans want to improve their lives. They have a right to improve their lives, and it's a moral good to improve their lives. Because the moral of the story is this. Who suffers here? Who loses here? The people in the hunter tribe have baskets they never could have made if they had given 1,000 years to it because they just don't make baskets. They have baskets that are far better than the baskets they used to have. Do they suffer? No. The gatherer tribe has spears they never could have had before. They are doing better and their lives are enriched by the superior quality of this new item. Do they suffer? No. What does happen is the guy who trades the baskets and the guy who trades the spears has more shiny rocks or more seashells than the other people, but nobody loses. Nobody loses. Everybody wins. Wealth is created out of thin air. It's a miracle. Another thing we take for granted. And I think the final thing we take for granted in this civilization of ours, in this underground city that we can't see, is we take freedom for granted. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I have a lot of ground to cover and I want to leave you people before it becomes dawn. But the thing that we also have is we have freedom. And freedom is such an abused word. It's so common. Oh, we have freedom, we got freedom, 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 freedom. What really does freedom mean? Freedom means that I can stand here at this podium with you and talk to you about things that you may violently disagree with, vehemently disagree with. But freedom means I can tell you about them without any fear to the consequences of myself. And that means that you and I can have an argument or a discussion, and you can have 100 reasons why I'm wrong, and you can give me these 100 reasons, and if these reasons make sense, I will change my mind. Think about that. That is the product of freedom. Freedom means that in Western society, ideas become a reactor. A reactor. It's not just a furnace, it's a reactor, where ideas, good and bad, are crushed together by the force of the combined power of the civilization and produce an explosive reaction that generates the energy of the intellect of the human mind, and it allows us to come to some form of truth. It doesn't say I'm right. I don't say you have to listen to me because I'm right. Freedom says, you listen to me, and I'll listen to you, and maybe we can achieve truth together. It's self-correcting. It's powerful. It's magnificent. Every time people disagree, like with law, you should get down on your knees and thank God that you live in a society where you are allowed to openly disagree. So when I hear politicians say, what we're really looking for is unity, I don't want unity. I want disagreement. I want actual violent argument. I don't want violence. I want a reactor, a marketplace of ideas where the best ideas win and the best ideas are sharpened and corrected and honed in the same way that the engineering is sharpened and corrected and honed to make an iPhone. Freedom is intellectual wealth. And freedom comes from the West. Nobody else does this. Nobody does this the way we do it. Nobody. This is why this civilization has to be defended. So, why are we so filled with despair? Why are we so filled with despair? We're filled with despair because we've been told by our moral betters that there is no future for us, that the future really doesn't exist in the way that we understood the future. I am a product of the space age. My entire life was formed by watching The Wonderful World of Disney and seeing these Werner von Braun animations about guys going into orbit and all of these things, and all these things are possible. And my dad took me to the 1964 World Fair in New York City, and I rode on GM's Futurama 2 carousel, and I saw we're going to have moon bases by 1980, and we're going to be harvesting the oceans by 1995, and we're going to be doing all of these wonderful things, and we're going to have nuclear-powered cars, and everything's going to be great, and there's going to be prosperity and wealth for everyone, because wealth can be created out of thin air. There's no limit to what we can do. No limit to what we can do. NASA had an expression during the 60s, and their expression was Saturn by 70. They thought they would be at the planet Saturn by 1970. Not 2170, not 2070, 1970. Anything was possible. We had confidence in who we are and what we can do. And nothing has changed except the confidence. Our skill, if anything, has improved. We went to the moon on slide rules. That's why so many young people, by the way, believe that the lunar landing was a conspiracy, because the video quality is so poor and there weren't any computers. They simply cannot accept the fact that we had not only the brains but the will to do it. We don't have that will anymore. That future of prosperity and freedom and achievement and rising potential has been taken away from us by this narrative. That the future of humanity is going to be a few 100,000 people sitting around thatch huts while you burn an animal patty and we're eating our sustainable algae cakes. That's not the future that I have in mind. And when you have a big future, when you have an unlimited future, the asymptote goes away. There's no limit to what we can do in the West. None. And if you gave people, the young people, the sense that progress is not a restriction on human behavior. Progress means doing things that have never been done before. Boldly going where no man has gone before. That's progress. I grew up in a society that had an idea of progress. In the 21st century, I never wake up saying, where's my jetpack? Where's my jetpack? I was promised a jetpack and I want one. Why? Do we really wonder why our kids have to cut themselves to find some sense of stimulation in this world without a future? Who shut the future down on us? We did. We shut it down on ourselves because we were bored. It's global warming, or was whatever it's going to be, whatever the reason is, expect less, expect smaller, expect less. In Britain today, facing the problems they face, the most common attitude among the British citizenry today is, thank God I'm not going to live long enough to see the end. That is the common attitude in London today among old Britons. Think about that. Why is it, do you think, that all of these birth rates in socialist countries are 1.2%? Greece, the birth rate's 1.3, Spain is 1.2, 0.3. That means that every 50 years those countries decline by half of their population. Well, there are some people out there who are not declining by half. And there are some people who see the skyscrapers in downtown Toronto and other cities around the world and they say, the West clearly has a death wish. They've lost their will to live. They've lost their will to have children. The children don't have a future. The children don't believe in anything. It's just a matter of time. So we're in some trouble. So the question I would ask you is, kind of in wrapping this whole thing up, if I've made a case that the civilization is worth protecting and worth defending, worth dying for, because other people are dying to come to it, then the question I would ask you is, what price are you willing to pay for it? Because the great, great destruction of the modern age is, we don't have to pay for anything, do we? Everything's free. Everything's taken care of. There's no sacrifice. There's no hardship. There's no nothing. Everything's free. So what are you willing to pay for all of this stuff? When I talk to American audiences, I talk about what are you willing to pay for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But we're a bunch of cowboys. We like guns and fast cars and explosions down there. We're not as refined as we are up here. So the question I will ask you is, what are you willing to pay for peace, order, and good government? What are you willing to pay? If you're willing to pay for peace, you have to pay two things. You have to pay a moral price and you have to pay a physical price. Physical price is easier to understand. If you're willing to pay for peace, you have to pay for your defense. You have to pay for the ability to defend your civilization. It costs money. And we're friends here. I admire Canadians more than any people in the world. But you have outsourced your defense to the taxpayers of the United States of America. Canada, after World War II, had the 4th largest navy in the world. There's not a country on the face of the earth that has punched above its population weight in terms of its military capabilities than Canada. What happened? I think there's a ship left in the Canadian Navy. Sure. We have had a similar experience in the United States. So, if you want peace, you have to be prepared to write a check for your defense. And you have to do something much harder than write a check, because we have money in the West. Money's not a problem for us. You have to have the moral courage. Canadian soldiers have the physical courage and the moral courage, as do American soldiers, as do British soldiers, as do Australian soldiers, as do all of them. But you as a population have to have the moral courage to take your enemies at their word. You have to have the moral courage to understand that people want you dead because they want the skyscrapers that you live in, and when you decide to be nice to them by talking about allowing things like Sharia into your society, they don't go, oh, they're swell, let's not hurt them. They go, they're weak, they have a death wish, they want to die, let's help them. You have to understand that. That requires moral courage. If you want order, what do you have to do? You have to be prepared to have law and enforce the law. And people come to Canada because of the law. And if you are seriously talking about having two different laws for two different classes of people, you will not have law or order in this country. Neither. There is one law for everybody. That's what people are coming here for. They're coming for equal treatment under the law. This idea that we're going to implement Sharia, which is antithetical to everything that we believe, antithetical to everything that we believe, antithetical to the idea of free exchange of ideas, antithetical to freedom for women and homosexuals, antithetical to everything that you believe. The idea that we're having this discussion is a sign of a suicidal death wish in this culture, in this civilization. I have no problem whatsoever. I am all about freedom. I have no problem whatsoever with people living under Sharia. Go live under Sharia someplace else. Don't bring it here. Because they cannot coexist together. They cannot. They are antithetical to each other. There is a matter-antimatter reaction, and one of them will win. You're not doing anybody any favors by doing that. They came here to get away from that stuff. And if we're going to tell ourselves how morally advanced we are, by lying down and putting a knife at our own throats, that's not moral advantage. And that's not civilization, it's not gentleness, and it's not generosity. It's suicide. You need to have the moral courage to face that. And finally, if you want good government, you have to have an understanding that you have a government that has to be economically sustainable, a government that has to pay its own bills. Now, of all the things I'm here to talk about tonight, I can tell you the thing that fills me with the most pain by a wide margin is the fact that this American patriot has to go to Canada to find a country that is freer, has better economic policies, and a higher per capita income than the country I love. That is a shocking and embarrassing thing to this American. And you should be proud of yourself. Because the Canadian government has done what had to be done. It has done what had to be done. It got entitlement spending under control. We have different values as a culture. We have completely different values about national health care and all this other thing. But the fact is, this conservative government has made the economy sustainable. And that is the basic definition of good government. Each people gets to determine what government they want, but your government is starting to look like it's sustainable. Our government is not. And in America, we have an election coming up, and the choice we have to face is, are we going to be Greece, or are we going to be Wisconsin? I have a great deal of hope for the American people that in a blue state, a liberal state like Wisconsin that is failing like my own state of California, but nothing is failing as fast as California, I have hope that we will understand that by talking about reforming these programs, we are talking about the only way to save them. And so this idea that Republicans are here to destroy Social Security is nonsense. Republicans are trying to make Social Security pay for itself so that it's not destroyed by a $66 trillion unfunded liability that is being proposed by the Democrats as if there's nothing wrong. The brilliant thing about the Ryan plan, just to get into one little specific thing, is to say we have debt and we have revenue, and instead of trying to pile up additional revenue and lower the debt, what the Ryan plan does is says move the fulcrum. Move the fulcrum on Social Security by 2 years, raise the retirement age from 65 to 67 over the course of 20 years, and the financial problems of the United States go away. What's so hard about this? It should be self-evident, right? Peace, order, good government. What are you willing to pay for them? You need to ask yourself these questions. This is your civilization too. So what are the solutions? Well, the first solution is, because I know people are looking for answers these days, the first solution is, I know it sounds like a football line, but the first solution is we never give up. We never, ever give up. Ever. Because the destructive force on civilizations is always despair. There's no problem that we can't beat. None. There's no problem that we can beat. None. We can solve all of these problems. The only problem we cannot solve is despair, is the sense of hopelessness, in the sense that this is not something that can be controlled anymore. We got ourselves into this mess, we can get ourselves out of this mess. It may take 30 or 40 years, to get into it, doesn't matter. All we have to do is decide to go. That's why we have footprints on the moon. It's not because we have the technology. We have the technology now. My country can't get into space anymore. We're infinitely more capable of traveling in space, we just don't have the will. It's not important to us anymore. So we have to give up this idea of despair. I think the other thing we have to do is we have to understand who our allies are. Because we have allies in this world. That's why I'm here talking to you people, because you're our allies. You're America's allies. You're Britain's allies. You're Australia's allies. You are civilization. You are allies of Israel. You're allies of the idea of science and freedom and maximum human potential. So let me tell you who your allies are in this fight. How many of you out there believe that anti-Semitism is a moral evil? Raise your hand. I certainly do. It's a moral evil. Anti-Semitism is a moral evil. It's prejudging people, and it's based on envy, and it's based on a lot of other things that are not very pleasant human qualities. And I wouldn't expect anybody in this building to admit to making anti-Semitic comments. How many of you made anti-American comments? What's the difference? What's the difference? I don't see a difference. We're your allies. We're your friends. We're in this together. We have the same values. We like things a little bit louder and faster and noisier down there and more violent. But that's okay. That gives us something to compare each other to. It gives us something that's different that we can be proud of. So the last thing I want to do today is I want to remind you of the moment in Lord of the Rings, which is such a powerful and deep story. It's not a fantasy story. It's not Dungeons and Dragons. It is human truth refined to its absolute essence. And I want to remind you about that moment when the city is under siege and you feel like there's no hope and there's no chance of defeating these armies of evil that want your head on a stick. And the desperation and the loneliness of wondering if Rohan is going to come to the aid of Gondor. We need allies out there. There's not a whole lot of people that get this whole thing about Western civilization, you know. We have allies. And the thing I'm trying to convince you of tonight, strangely enough, is not that America is your allies, because we are, of course, your allies. But rather, not only are Americans your allies, but Christians are your allies, fundamentalist Christians are your allies, and conservatives in America are your allies. So the last thing I want to do tonight is leave you with the understanding of conservatism as I understand conservatism. Because I know a lot of people in Canada very liberal, and I know they look at the Tea Party in America and they look at American conservatives as being the enemy. But we're not the enemy. We're allies. So let me explain to you about my philosophy. I can do this in just a couple minutes. You know, when you talk about the history of the American political system, the founding of America was the revolutionary, liberal, radical idea that individual people can govern themselves. That you didn't need kings and emperors and the elite telling you what to do. That was a liberal, radical idea. The idea of individuals being responsible for their own destiny and limits on government has become a very conservative idea in the United States. How did that happen? How did it go from being liberal to conservative? You know, the Republican Party was founded in 1856. John Fremont was the first candidate. And it was called the Black Republican Party as a means of, it's a derogatory term. The Republican Party was established from the Whig Party to prevent slavery in America. And John Fremont lost in 1856, but in 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected by a fluke, really. Kind of like Canadian politics, how that happens sometimes. The least bad choice kind of guy. But he was a fluke. But Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860, a Republican president. And most people don't know this because people think that the Confederacy left because of Lincoln's actions. But the 7 states of the Deep Confederacy were out of the Union in the time between Lincoln's election and before Lincoln was actually inaugurated. The 7 states of the Deep South had left the Union before Lincoln raised his hand and was sworn into office. You know why? Because the Deep South, the Confederacy, knew that the election of a Republican president meant the end of slavery in America. They knew it. That's why they left, because they knew it was the end for them. In 1864, the Republicans ran Lincoln again, but the Democrats ran a guy named George McClellan. He was a war hero. And George McClellan's platform in 1864 was the Constitution as it is and the Union as it was. McClellan's basic case on behalf of the Democratic Party was, come on back, Confederates, bring your slaves with you, let's just pretend it never happened. 13th Amendment was supposed to originally to guarantee slavery in America. So that was the Democratic position in 1864. Right after the war, the Ku Klux Klan, these were all Democrats in the defeated South. The Ku Klux Klan was a democratic institution. The Jim Crow laws, separate but equal, not separate but equal, the colored drinking fountain, those are the result of democratic policies in the South in the 1900s and 20s and 30s. And all of those guys turning fire hoses on those poor black protesters in Selma, Alabama, guys like Bull Connor and Lester Maddox and George Wallace, all Democrats. You tell this to kids today, they don't believe you, but it's true. So what happened? How is it now that the Democrats are the party of minorities and Republicans are the evil racists? If you listen to the Democrats tell it, they'll tell you that the parties switch sides. That's a memo I never got. I didn't get a memo saying, we're up by 7 touchdowns at halftime, now go in and switch jerseys with the other team. I never got that memo. I can tell you what did happen. What happened is, we reached the top of a hill. So the question is, I want you to visualize one last thing in my close tonight. I want you to visualize a graph. Excuse me. I want you to visualize a graph because I have one objective in my life. My objective is maximum human awesomeness. And I describe human awesomeness as increased liberty, increased prosperity, increased freedom, increased ability to become everything that you can be. I'm in favor of increased awesomeness. That's my only objective in life. My only commitment in life is to tell the truth. So if it turns out I'm speaking in error, I will apologize and change my mind and tell you where I'm in error. So, in order to think about why conservatives are your allies, if you're a liberal, in this giant fight that we face, I would ask you to think about this. A vertical axis, which is awesomeness. Increasing awesomeness means increasing freedom and human potential. A horizontal axis, which is not time but activism. Increasing busybodiness, increasing political agitation, increasing change, increasing progressivism, if you'd like. Modern liberals, modern progressives anyway, think that increasing progressivism means increasing awesomeness. The more progressive and the more activist you become, the better things get. Conservatives believe that increasing activism decreases human awesomeness. Things get worse the more activism there is. So who's right? Turns out they're both right. They're just right at different times. When race relations were about people being held in bondage, the Republican Party was a liberal party. It was a radical party. Because the Republican Party became about increasing human awesomeness, so that as we get into things like the liberation of the slaves, that increases awesomeness, it increases human potential. We're in favor of it. We're liberals. This side of the graph, if it's red and blue, is all blue. We're all liberals, people of goodwill, when you're increasing human freedom by activism. And as we get into things like the poll taxes and all of these other things, and the Civil Rights Acts and all these other things, we are increasing freedoms. We're increasing goodness. We're liberals. We're on the blue side of the hill. But if you reach a point where continued activism starts to make things worse, then people who are paying attention might say, wait a minute, we're going downhill now. We're on the other side of this bell curve. What does that mean? Well, it means that if you set aside a quota system for black people and you say that a big program like affirmative action means that if it needs an 850 to get into a college if you're white but only a 600 if you're black, people like us who were liberals in terms of raising freedom say this isn't good for people. This doesn't help them. It tells them that they're inferior. It broadcasts to them that they're not as good as the rest of us. This is bad. This is making things worse. We're going to stop here now. We're not going to be progressives anymore. Now we're going to stop. We're going to be conservatives because we judge that we are at the top of the hill of human awesomeness. And President Obama has already implemented a policy. It's not something he's thinking about doing. It's a tiny little thing. But he has implemented a policy of racial equality in punishment. And what that means is if a school district has 12 black children expelled from school, there will be 12 white children expelled from school, regardless of the types of infractions or the number of infractions. That is not increasing human awesomeness. That's not good for anybody. It's not good for the white kids, and they know they're not going to expel white kids who haven't done anything. It doesn't deal with the problems of the entitlement in the underclass. It's an entire different discussion. But people like me say, no, we have reached the top of this hill. People are legally free and protected. They have the same rights as everybody else. Why don't we treat them the way that this other big Republican talked about treating them when he said, I would like my children to be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Which means you're not automatically bad if you're black, but you're not automatically good if you're black either. You will be treated as an individual. The essence of conservatism is the treatment of people not as a series of tribes at war with each other, but as individuals. So while I am a liberal, while we're increasing freedom and awesomeness, when we start to decrease it on the other side of that hill, I stop. And I say, I don't want to go any further. And sometimes I say I have to go backwards now, because things were better before. You can make the same exact case with something like the Environmental Protection Agency. Lake Erie used to be devoid of life. The Ohio River outside of Cleveland caught fire. It burned for a couple of days. I remember as a kid sitting in traffic and seeing puffs of blue smoke coming out of the exhaust of the cars in front of us, and at the airport there'd be black streaks leading into the sky. When you're talking about eliminating heavy metals from the oceans and from the rivers and from the water table, I'm all about the EPA. I think the EPA is fantastic. I am a liberal and a progressive because it is increasing the quality of life. I come from Los Angeles and I got there in 1988. We have 4 times as many cars on the road now as we did then. We instituted these vapor recovery things. I was in Los Angeles, this is not a joke, I was in LA for 3 weeks in the middle of this smog, and one day it cleared. I went, my God, I live in a valley. I live in a valley, there are mountains out there. Those days are behind us because of the EPA. So while the EPA is doing things like improving the quality of the environment, I'm a liberal. I'm all about increased activism. But when the EPA says that it starts to cost $1 billion and 6 years and thousands of pages of regulation, and the entire Central Valley of California, which is the most productive agricultural region in the world, is being shut down because of a delta smelt, which is indistinguishable from the things that are put on the pizzas that are delivered to the people in Sacramento, you have to ask yourself if we haven't gone down the far side of this. So maybe it's time to stop being so liberal and so progressive and time to start conserving some of these things and to say, we've gone too far. We need to go back a little bit. You can make the same case for feminism, the same case for everything else. Now, the reason this is important is this. If you understand this, you understand that conservatives and liberals are not enemies of each other. They're not in opposition. They want the same thing. They just disagree about where this thing starts to go downhill, and people of reason can have reasonable disagreements. We're not your enemies. We're your friends. We're your allies. We have enough real enemies to not have to have this upper limit problem of inventing our own enemies. This civilization deserves to be protected. It's the greatest civilization in the history of the world. And all I can say is, as they said in Lord of the Rings, I can't do anything about what comes in the future. I can just say, not today. Not today. Not on my watch. Not today. Not going to happen while I'm still drawing breath. Just not going to happen. It's not going to happen. I'm not going to let it happen. And the final thing I will say to you tonight, this genuinely is the last thing. I know there's I promise. I know a lot of Jewish people out there tonight, and it was a pleasure to come and speak to a Jewish group. And I know that if you're a member of the Jewish community, you know things like the story about the protocols of Zion, and that the blood libel that Jews kill babies, Arab babies, and bake their blood into their matzah. You know how repulsive and repugnant, disgusting that idea is. Well, I'm here to tell you, I was an atheist for a long time. I became an agnostic because I lost my certainty about things that I can't prove. But I now, as a conservative, deal with conservative Christians all the time. And I'm here to tell you, and you're just going to have to take my word for it, that this idea that conservative Christians are just waiting for Jews to be converted, or want them to die so that the apocalypse can come and Jesus comes back, It's not a muted idea. It's not a shaded idea. It's not something that's whispered. It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. My best friend is a pastor. He's a conservative Christian pastor. He and I are very different in a lot of ways. It doesn't exist. If you don't believe me, you have to ask yourself why so many people believe that the blood libel exists and the protocols of the Elders of Zion exist. It's told all the time. It doesn't exist. We're allies. We're friends. That's why I'm here.